The sound that woke me up was all wrong. It wasn't a bird or a lawnmower or some over-caffeinated jogger's Bluetooth speaker blasting Eye of the Tiger. It was heavier, mechanical, grinding, like someone was trying to rip the earth in half with a forklift. By the time I grabbed my jeans and bolted out the front door barefoot, they'd already taken a chunk out of the wall. My wall. More specifically, the back wall of my grandfather's old barn, a hand-built, cedar-planked monument to stubbornness and splinters, and the only thing on this property older than the water pipes and the oak tree out front. There were two men in orange vests, hard hats, and zero expressions. One held a clipboard. The other operated a backhoe that looked about 5 minutes away from turning the entire barn into kindling. Between them stood a third figure, petite, smug, and unmistakably wearing a Powerwalk tracksuit in HOA beige. "Excuse me," I shouted, arms flailing in a mix of disbelief and adrenaline. "What the hell is going on?" She turned slowly like a movie villain just before the monologue. "Mr. Redding," she said with the kind of smile that made me want to check if I still had all my organs. "This structure has been deemed non-compliant and unsafe. Demolition was authorized under Article 14, Section C of the Community Standards Agreement." I blinked. "The what?" Clipboard guy stepped forward, flipping to a page with what looked like a faxed copy of a middle school essay. "Emergency removal of non-aesthetic structures," he recited, "voted on by the HOA board, signed this morning." I didn't even bother asking who was on the board. I already knew. Just one name mattered: Sheila D. Graff, president of the HOA, self-appointed guardian of suburbia, and apparently someone who confused community service with light dictatorship. I ran past them and slammed my hand against the barn's side. The wood was warm from the morning sun, solid despite its age. This wasn't just some old shed. This was his. "Stop the machine," I said, not shouting this time. I looked directly at the operator. "That barn's been here longer than this HOA. Hell, probably longer than half this neighborhood." "No permit on file," Sheila said sweetly, "and it's bringing down property values." I stared at her. "Lady, I've seen your front porch. A broken windmill planter and a plastic flamingo aren't exactly curb appeal gold." Her smile twitched. The operator hesitated. "That was my only win of the morning." Inside the barn were things you couldn't replace. Tools, yes, the kind that still had hand-forged iron and wooden handles worn smooth by decades of real work. But more than that, there were stories. My grandfather's journals, boxes of letters, old photo plates, a map he swore was from the Civil War. I always assumed that part was an exaggeration, but now I wasn't so sure. Let me rewind a second. My name's Miles Redding. I'm 38, live alone, work remote as a historical archivist, which is a fancy way of saying I spend too much time in dusty rooms or digitizing things other people threw away. 2 years ago, after my grandfather passed, I inherited his old place in Creekstone Hollow. Quiet neighborhood, decent folks, trees that actually provide shade, and yeah, a barn out back that leans a little to the left if you look at it wrong, but still stands proud like it knows something the rest of us forgot. When I moved in, I thought I'd found the perfect blend of peace and nostalgia. The kind of house you don't just live in, you keep. You tend to it like a legacy. That barn? It's not just old wood and rusted hinges. My grandfather built it himself in the 50s, beam by beam. He carved his initials into the base of the frame along with mine, right next to a sketch of a hammer we made when I was 6. There's a handprint of mine in dried paint on the back wall, half covered by a shelf full of war medals and antique radios. You don't bulldoze that, not unless you've got a crowbar where your soul should be. Of course, Sheila didn't care about that. Sheila cared about community standards and property aesthetics, words she weaponized with the precision of a Bond villain and the emotional range of a toaster. When I first moved in, she brought me a lemon cake that tasted like drywall and made sure I knew we take presentation very seriously here. I nodded, smiled, and never touched the cake again. For a while, she left me alone. Then one day I repainted the barn's trim red, same color it was when I was a kid, and that's when the letters started showing up. At first it was a note about the color palette not conforming to HOA historical guidelines. Then came a warning about visible clutter. She meant a coiled up hose. Finally, she sent a formal citation because my vegetation line was uncurated. Yes, that's a real word she used. I had to look it up. I ignored most of it, the way I figured people like her feed on attention, and besides, I figured it would blow over. But I underestimated just how badly Sheila needed to be in control, and I never imagined that her next move wouldn't be another citation or a snide letter, but a backhoe. And that was the day everything changed. The first time Sheila violated my property, she left a post-it note on my door like it was a polite suggestion. In bright pink ink, complete with curly loops and smiley faces, it read, "Friendly reminder, all external structures must conform to HOA aesthetic policy. Your barn," quotes hers, "is unapproved and structurally questionable. Please schedule a review." I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, mostly trying to figure out if I was meant to laugh, scream, or frame it as a warning to future generations. See, there's a certain level of delusion where people genuinely believe smiley faces make tyrannical nonsense more palatable. Sheila had mastered that art form. If she ever invaded a small country, the tanks would be pastel and the missiles would arrive wrapped in gift bows. But I let it go. It was just a note. Then, 2 days later, I came home to find a bright orange tag stapled, yes, stapled, to the wooden post at the corner of my barn. It read, "Pre-compliance notice, subject to structural review." The notice was printed on some kind of carbon triplicate form, like it had been dug up from a Cold War filing cabinet. I peeled it off and examined the staple holes in the wood like someone checking a wound. Not deep, but still, someone had trespassed onto my property to post it. No knock, no letter, no email, just a direct hit. That was strike one. I marched over to the HOA office the next morning, somewhat a glorified mailroom attached to the clubhouse where retired yoga mats went to die, and asked for clarification. Sheila was already waiting. "Oh, Mr. Redding," she said, rising from behind her desk like a Bond villain caught mid-latte. "So glad you came in. We've had several concerns raised by neighbors about your structure." I blinked. "You mean my barn?" She tilted her head like a golden retriever trying to understand long division. "Let's not get caught up in terminology." I should have known right then what kind of game I was in. She pulled out a binder, I swear this thing had chapters, and flipped to a page that featured what looked like a satellite image of my backyard, complete with the barn circled in red ink like it had committed a war crime. "We've identified several potential violations: non-uniform exterior coloring, unsealed wood, exposed fasteners, possible pest harborage, and non-standard roofing materials." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. "You just described half the historical buildings in New England." She didn't flinch. "This isn't New England. This is Creekstone Hollow, and we have standards." There it was. The word, standards. In HOA speak, standards means whatever I just made up and decided applies to you, not me. I asked to see the bylaw she was referencing. She flipped to a vague clause about non-conforming outbuildings and waved her hand like she'd just summoned the ghost of suburban order. "I'd be happy to work with you on a compliance plan," she said, smiling sweetly, "but the barn will need to be reviewed by a structural assessor and possibly repainted, trimmed, and updated to match approved neighborhood palette options." "You want me to repaint a cedar barn built in 1952? To match what exactly?" She slid a laminated color swatch across the table. "Dignity sand, heritage taupe, gentle mist." "None of these are colors," I said. "They're personality disorders." Her smile thinned. "It's about cohesion." I left without agreeing to anything, but she'd made her first move. She declared the barn out of compliance and made it clear that any response short of full surrender would be met with escalation, which in Sheila speak meant, "Nice legacy you've got there. Be a shame if it were cited for non-regulated lattice work." The final cherry on top? That weekend, I caught her on my security camera, mid-sunset, clipboard in hand, measuring the barn. Literally, tape measure out, taking notes. She didn't even flinch when she saw the camera. She just looked straight at the lens, gave a tight little smirk, and scribbled something down. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with a compromise. Sheila wasn't filing complaints, she was building a case. And that barn, that memory-soaked, hand-built, time-worn piece of my family's past, had just become target number one. What I didn't know was that her real violations hadn't even started yet. I thought the stapled violation notice was bad. I was wrong. That was just the amuse-bouche of Sheila's four-course power trip. 3 days after our little chat in the clubhouse, I came home to find my mailbox stuffed with identical envelopes, HOA warnings, each printed on thick cardstock that probably cost more than the stamps. Violation number 117A, unsealed wood on secondary structure. Violation number 117B, non-HOA approved window hardware, seriously, a hinge. Violation number 117C, improper storage of vintage tools, aka the antique rake hanging on the barn's exterior wall like decoration. I wish I were kidding. Sheila didn't just escalate, she mobilized. That same evening, I saw 2 HOA board members, well, board adjacents since Sheila had stacked the roster with her book club, casing my backyard from across the street, armed with notepads and what looked suspiciously like a laser distance measurer. It got worse. That weekend, while I was at the County Historical Society's archive scanning 1860s railroad maps, my version of a spa day, I came home to find that someone had strung caution tape across the front gate of my barn. Caution, unsafe structure, do not enter. There was no official seal, no city documentation, just yellow tape and a laminated HOA notice zip-tied to the fence post like a suburban eviction. I yanked it down before the sun hit it, but I already saw neighbors peeking through blinds and whispering. One guy, Carl from 2 doors down, asked if I was running an illegal blacksmith operation. I said yes. We forge artisanal vengeance on Tuesdays. Still, it wasn't funny, not really, because then Sheila got physical. Monday morning, I heard the sound of tires on gravel out back. When I stepped outside, I saw a pair of workers in neon vests unloading a dumpster onto my lawn. A whole damn roll-off construction dumpster, 20 feet long, smack in front of the barn. "Excuse me?" I called. One of them looked up. We were told this was pre-approved for demolition materials. By who? HOA. I actually laughed. "You got paperwork?" He hesitated. "We got a standing order from the property compliance officer." Oh, of course. Sheila had upgraded her self-image again. She wasn't just president now, she was compliance officer. Next stop, Supreme Overlord. I made them stop and park it on the curb, but the message was clear. She was sending in the troops. Still, I tried to keep my cool. There's only so many middle fingers a historian can throw before it starts looking unprofessional. Then came the day she crossed the line, literally. It was early morning, gray sky, coffee in hand, and I was standing in the barn, reorganizing some old display cases that once held my grandfather's war memorabilia. I'd just moved a wooden crate labeled newspapers, 1930s, when I heard the engine. Not a car, not a truck, a saw. I sprinted out the side door and turned the corner to find 2 hired workers, same vests, same confused expressions, cutting into the barn's side paneling. "What the hell are you doing?" One of them jumped, the other wiped his brow. "We were told to remove non-compliant siding. HOA said this one's scheduled for partial teardown." "Scheduled by who?" A Sheila?" I nearly dropped my mug. "Sheila doesn't own this property, I do, and you're trespassing." They backed off immediately, to their credit, but not before one of them knocked over a shelf of items stacked just inside the wall. And that's when it happened. The crash wasn't loud, but it was enough. I heard the delicate clink of glass, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain even catches up. I rushed inside and found it on the floor. My grandfather's shadow box, shattered, the glass case that held his Bronze Star, his dog tags, and a folded letter from Eisenhower himself, thanking him for service on the 1944 Logistics Corps team. It had sat on that shelf undisturbed for over 30 years. Now the velvet was soaked in coffee from my dropped mug. The glass had spiderwebbed across the metal. The letter was torn along the fold. I just stood there, staring. The workers were already apologizing, trying to help, but I waved them off. Just go." They left. And I sat there, on the barn floor, surrounded by broken glass and war medals, staring at the damage. My grandfather never asked for recognition, never bragged. But that box, that was his story, his legacy, and now it was cracked open like roadkill because someone decided it didn't match their approved neighborhood palette. And that's when the anger finally hit. Not loud, not explosive, cold, quiet, focused. Sheila hadn't just crossed a line, she'd bulldozed it. And I wasn't going to let that stand. Not for the barn, not for my grandfather, not for this community. She wanted a war over aesthetics? Fine. I was about to make history look ugly. Despite the busted metal case, the caution tape circus, and the unsolicited wall sawing, I still wanted to handle things the adult way. Mostly because I figured if I ended up on the evening news, I'd prefer to be holding a letter of formal complaint, not a crowbar. So I tried the channels. First stop, the HOA appeals board, which, as it turns out, is just Sheila and 2 people who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. One of them I'm pretty sure joined for the free donuts. I sent in a written appeal first, complete with timestamped security footage of the trespassing incident, a copy of my deed, and, for flavor, a side-by-side photo comparison of my barn and Sheila's own approved garden shed, which I kindly labeled the plastic lean-to of hypocrisy. The reply came back the next day, not from a lawyer, from Sheila. "Dear Mr. Redding, thank you for your impassioned letter. However, the HOA's structural integrity concerns remain unresolved. You may contest our findings at the next scheduled compliance review, March 11th, 2026. Sincerely, Sheila D. Graff, Compliance Chairwoman and HOA President. That's right, she booked me into a hearing 3 years out. Strike 1. Next, I filed a formal complaint with the city zoning office. The receptionist, whose name tag read Clint and whose attitude read "I peaked in 1997, informed me the city generally defers to HOA jurisdiction unless safety violations are present. When I asked if unpermitted demolition attempts and unauthorized trespassing counted, he shrugged and handed me a 4-page complaint form printed on paper so thin it may have predated the barn. I filled it out. I attached documentation. I even included a short paragraph about the sentimental and historical significance of the barn, hoping maybe Clint had a soft spot for old veterans or American history. 2 weeks later, I got a notice in the mail. Case closed, no municipal violation found. Defer to HOA bylaws. Strike 2. Still, I wasn't done. I called a property lawyer I'd used once when a publishing company tried to reprint one of my archival essays without credit. He was smart, cheap for a lawyer, and sounded like he'd seen some things. After hearing the story, he said, "Sounds like you're up against a petty tyrant with too much time and not enough oversight." "Yes," I said. "Her name's Sheila." He agreed to draft a cease and desist, a sharp one. We cited everything: unlawful trespassing, destruction of private property, false code enforcement, potential defamation by public HOA notices. I signed it, notarized it, sent it by certified mail. It arrived on a Thursday. On Friday, Sheila responded. She didn't call, she didn't email, she didn't even send her standard Comic Sans threats. She posted a full-color community update on the HOA bulletin board and everyone's mailbox, featuring a list of ongoing non-compliance cases. Guess whose barn made the top of the list? There it was, in bold. Reading residence, non-historic storage structure, unsafe foundation, eyesore grade 3. I don't even know what eyesore grade 3 means. I'm assuming it's below derelict dumpster, but above Gothic mailbox. Beneath it, in smaller print, was a friendly reminder to respect community decorum and a notice that retaliation against HOA officers is a Class B violation. Class B, what are we, a correctional facility? Strike 3, foul ball, whatever. I was out. And the cherry on top? My neighbor Barb, the one who used to bring me zucchini bread and tell me about her grandkids, suddenly stopped waving. When I passed her on the sidewalk that weekend, she crossed the street like I was radioactive. Later, I found out why. Sheila had told several neighbors I was in legal trouble with the HOA and that I may be attracting city inspectors. Apparently, I was now that neighbor. The one who made the street look bad. The one who put everyone's property value in peril. The one with the mysterious, dangerous barn that might harbor black mold, termites, or satanic rituals depending on which coffee group you asked. And just like that, my quiet life turned into a PR nightmare. The worst part? I was still trying to play by the rules. I hadn't retaliated. I hadn't thrown up flyers or posted angry rants online. I'd submitted paperwork, I'd filed formal complaints, I'd followed every polite official channel I could find. And all I had to show for it was a smashed metal case, a reputation in flames, and a stack of HOA notices thick enough to kill a squirrel if thrown with conviction. But I wasn't finished. I didn't grow up in this house, inherit this barn, and catalog hundreds of years of American resilience to get steamrolled by a woman who thinks compliance is a personality. No, if Sheila wanted a war, she was about to learn what happens when a historian digs deeper. And brother, I was about to hit gold. The twist came, ironically, while I was trying not to think about any of it. After weeks of whiplash from Sheila's parade of petty tyranny, I needed a break, a real one. So I did what any self-respecting introvert with a bottle of bourbon and a box of archival gloves does. I locked myself in the barn with a space heater and started organizing old crates. Therapy, but dustier. I figured if Sheila was going to keep trying to erase this place, the least I could do was document every square inch of it. Maybe I'd submit it to the local historical society. Maybe I'd just feel like I'd done something to preserve what my grandfather built. What I didn't expect was to literally stumble into a secret. I was dragging an old cabinet, oak, heavy, practically fused to the floor by decades of rust and forgotten nails, when one of the floorboards underneath gave a faint creak. Not the usual kind. This one sounded hollow. I froze, pried up the board. Underneath, dirt. I grabbed a flashlight. The beam hit something flat buried about 6 inches down. I dug with my hands until my fingers scraped wood. Small, rough, a box. A handmade chest, maybe the size of a shoebox. Wrapped in an old oilcloth. It had my grandfather's initials burned into the top. HR. I took it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and slowly pried open the latch. Inside were 4 things: a small leather-bound notebook, a stack of weathered papers tied with twine, an old iron key, and a sealed envelope addressed in my grandfather's handwriting, "For Miles, if she ever comes for the barn." I just stared at it for a minute, no date, no stamp, just a sentence that landed harder than it had any right to. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter. If you're reading this, then I guess someone finally tried to take what I built. The barn's more than boards and beams. It sits on top of something older. I found it in '54 when I was digging for the well expansion. Old bricks, timber, some kind of tunnel. I sealed it, figured best to leave history where it lies, but I kept records, documents I found inside. Turns out this land isn't just old, it's protected. Protected? I tore into the stack of papers. They were copies, fragile but legible. Legal deeds, maps, and correspondence dating back to 1867. One of them had a wax seal still mostly intact. Another bore the stamp of the Virginia Historical Easement Trust, an obscure preservation group I only knew about because I'd helped digitize some of their archives for a university grant years ago. I sat up straight. If what I was looking at was real, this wasn't just sentimental history. This land, the barn, was exempt. The 1867 deed granted the original structure standing as a designated agricultural holding, tied to pre-county boundary laws, and the easement from 1935 reaffirmed its status as non-transferable heritage land, passed directly through family lines, meaning no HOA, no local ordinances, not even state redevelopment orders could override it. It was buried under almost a century of bureaucratic dust, sure, but the legal standing was still valid. And Sheila? She'd been trying to destroy a historically protected structure. Suddenly, the entire circus made sense. She wasn't just trying to boost property values, she was trying to erase something that legally stood in her way. And then it hit me. The tunnel. If there was something under this land, a foundation, a cellar, a holding site from the 1800s, then this wasn't just a barn. It was a registered historic zone, which meant, oh hell, demolishing it, touching it, even drilling into it without proper authorization. That was a federal offense. And she'd sent men with power tools to carve into the walls. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly aware of just how quiet the house had become. My heartbeat felt louder than the wind outside. My grandfather had hidden this for decades, not because he didn't trust me, but because he trusted I'd know when the moment came. Well, Grandpa, the moment came, and she brought a bulldozer with it. I sat there for a long while, flipping through the notebook, handwritten entries about the tunnel, inventory lists, even some old photos he'd stashed behind a flap in the cover. One showed what looked like stone steps, half swallowed by soil, and below it, in pencil, just one line: "Whatever this is, it's not just mine. Protect it." By the time the sun came up, I had a plan brewing, but first, I had research to do. And if Sheila thought the barn was inconvenient before, she was about to learn what it meant to declare war on a structure that was legally untouchable. Because the only thing stronger than HOA rules: federal preservation law. I didn't sleep that night. Which, to be fair, wasn't a new development. I'd had more than a few 3 a.m. staring contests with the ceiling since this whole HOA soap opera started. But this time, it wasn't dread that kept me awake. It was adrenaline, strategy, and the realization that I held the one thing Sheila couldn't override with a memo or a measuring tape: the truth in triplicate. By sunrise, I had a rough battle plan. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a demolition expert, I'm not even particularly social. I once left a barbecue because someone asked if I wanted to circle back to potato salad. But I am a historian, and if there's one thing historians are good at, it's weaponizing documentation. Sheila had power, but I had paperwork. And now? I had proof that the barn was a protected historical structure with a lineage older than Creekstone Hollow's water tower. Step 1. Verify everything. I spent the next 2 days in full research mode. I cross-referenced the 1867 deed with the county's digital land registry. It wasn't online, of course, but a quick call to an archivist friend of mine in Richmond got me access to a scan of the original land grant. The description matched down to the creek bend and the old sycamore that still stands like a drunk linebacker in my backyard. Then I dug up the 1935 easement law. Turns out it was part of a post-depression land trust initiative aimed at preserving agricultural and trade-relevant heritage structures. It even had a clause exempting properties from governing bodies formed post-title, which in plain English meant HOAs. I printed everything, 3 copies each, labeled, indexed, bound in those cheap report folders you buy in bulk and swear you'll organize but never do, until a suburban war criminal gives you no choice. Step 2. Expert testimony. I reached out to Dr. Sheila Renner, no relation to my Sheila, thank God, who teaches American rural architecture at James Madison University. We'd corresponded a few times years back when I helped her digitize a WPA catalog of old tobacco barns. She agreed to review the barn structure virtually. I gave her a tour via Zoom, showed her the original joints, the beam carving, even the hardware. Her eyes lit up like she'd just discovered a new species of barn owl. "This isn't just vintage," she said. "This is textbook Depression-era handcrafting. You've got a museum piece on your hands." Bingo. She agreed to write a professional assessment letter confirming its historical and architectural significance. Step 3. The legal angle. I brought everything to my lawyer, the same guy who once told a plagiarizing publisher to prepare to eat their footnotes. He looked through the documents, nodded slowly, then muttered something I'll never forget. Well, 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 looks like someone's HOA just committed attempted heritage demolition. He drafted a formal injunction request, citing not just trespassing and destruction of personal property, but violation of federal historical easement protections. Even better, he found a clause in the HOA's own bylaws, page 42, buried under seasonal ornamentation guidelines, that required a 2/3 vote of all residents for any action that involved structural changes to legacy buildings. Which, you guessed it, they never got. Step 4. PR. This wasn't my usual lane, but I knew I had to control the narrative before Sheila got her next propaganda flyer into circulation. So I started small. I printed up a simple one-page handout, nothing flashy, with a photo of my grandfather standing next to the barn in 1955, smiling with a hammer slung over his shoulder. Underneath it, I wrote, "Did you know this barn predates the HOA, the subdivision, and most of our homes? It's legally protected under a federal preservation law, and someone tried to bulldoze it without your vote." I signed it with my name, address, and a note. If you've ever felt bullied by our HOA, come talk to me. This fight isn't just mine anymore. Then I walked door to door and handed out the flyers myself. Some neighbors closed the door fast. Others listened. One woman gave me banana bread. 2 offered to testify about Sheila's shady tactics. A teenage kid down the block asked if I needed drone footage. I did. By the end of the day, I'd collected 7 written statements, 2 old violation letters from other residents, and 1 blurry photo of Sheila instructing a crew to clear the back wall first, dated the day they shattered my grandfather's metal case. She hadn't just overstepped, she'd obliterated the line. And now, I had the documentation, the legal ammo, and the neighbors willing to stand behind me. For the first time since this whole mess started, the tide wasn't just turning, it was pulling back hard, ready to slam into her precious HOA headquarters like a historical tsunami. I looked out the kitchen window that night, coffee in one hand, report binder in the other. The barn stood quiet, resolute, still here, still standing. And so was I. The next move, mine. It started on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays are the kind of days that forget they exist. Not dramatic like Monday, not smug like Friday, just quietly inconvenient. The kind of day that sneaks up behind tyrants like Sheila and taps them on the shoulder with a stack of legal documents and a smile. By 8 a.m., the courthouse had received my lawyer's injunction paperwork. By 8:15, I'd sent an official certified letter to the HOA board citing violation of a federally recognized preservation easement. And by 9 o'clock, I was standing in front of Sheila's house with a copy of the cease and desist order, wearing my best neutral expression and holding a GoPro. Because yes, I filmed it. Because of course I did. She opened the door in what I assume was her compliance chic outfit. Blazer, clipboard, pinched expression like she was smelling something legally non-conforming. I held up the envelope. From my attorney, I said, "Please don't staple this to anything." She didn't take it. I placed it gently at her feet, right on her front doormat, which read, "This house runs on coffee and control issues. Too easy." Then I walked away. That evening, I hosted something Creekstone Hollow hadn't seen in over a year, a community meeting without an HOA agenda. I held it in my front yard. The barn stood behind me like a defiant middle finger to bureaucracy, freshly cleaned and adorned with a simple string of warm Edison bulbs I strung along the roofline. The irony that Sheila had once fined a neighbor for using unapproved holiday lumens made it all the sweeter. About 30 people showed up. A few came just for the banana bread Barb brought, but most came because they were tired of letters, tired of citations, tired of being bullied by someone who used bylaws like medieval torture devices. I stood on a wooden crate and told them everything. I showed them the documents, the original deed, the 1935 easement, the architectural review, the legal exemption clause buried in the HOA's own bylaws. I passed around a copy of the cease and desist order, a scanned letter from the Virginia Historical Commission, and, for good measure, the picture of Sheila instructing the crew to tear it down quick before he files something. And then I pulled out the letter from my grandfather. I read it aloud. By the end, there was a kind of silence you don't usually hear in suburbia, the real kind. Not the hush of closed blinds, but the quiet of understanding, of unity. Then came the questions. How do we stop her from doing this to someone else? Can we file complaints against her? Wait, she's been doing this for years. Are any of those fines even legal? It was like someone had removed a muzzle from the neighborhood. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd threatened. She'd fined a 72-year-old widower for having unapproved ivy. She'd tried to ban a disabled veteran from installing a wheelchair ramp because it wasn't aesthetic. One family had received 7 citations in 2 months for parking their own car in their driveway. I gathered the names, I collected the stories, and then I reached out to the Hollow Gazette, our local paper that mostly printed lost cat flyers and fundraisers for underperforming lemonade stands. But their editor, Marcus, was an old journalism major who'd been waiting 15 years for a real scandal. He showed up the next day with a camera, a notebook, and a grin that said, "Pulitzer me, baby." The headline on Thursday's front page? Barnstormed, Creekstone HOA president faces legal firestorm over historic property scandal. The article included photos of the barn, a quote from my preservation expert, 2 anonymous statements from neighbors about Sheila's intimidation tactics, and a picture of Sheila's precious eyesore grade 3 citation pinned next to my grandfather's bronze star. It blew up. People shared it on Nextdoor, on Facebook groups, even on Twitter, where it somehow got tagged #Barngate and #Sheila the Shredder. The HOA email inbox imploded. By Saturday morning, 3 members of the board had resigned. One of them left a typed note in the HOA Dropbox. We were told the barn was unsafe. We were not told it was a legal landmine. I want no part of this. At 10:43 a.m., my lawyer received an email from Sheila's personal attorney offering to amicably resolve the misunderstanding if I'd agree not to pursue damages or further legal action. I politely declined. Instead, I sent a follow-up letter to the County Preservation Authority and filed a formal request for the barn to be listed as a protected local heritage structure. If approved, it wouldn't just be exempt from HOA control, it would be placed on a regional map and recognized for its contribution to historical education, meaning Sheila could never touch it again, not even with a ruler. But the best moment, the real cherry on top, came at the next official HOA meeting, which I attended. Sheila, still clinging to her title like it was a royal birthright, stood at the podium in a beige pantsuit that could have been cut from the same cloth as her personality. The room was packed, folding chairs, standing room, even a few people watching through the windows. I waited until the floor opened to community comments. Then I stood up, walked to the mic, pulled out a copy of the easement law, and calmly said, "This barn stood through the Great Depression, a World War, 2 hurricanes, and 3 decades of HOA meetings. It's not going anywhere, but you, Sheila, might be." There was applause. Actual applause. Even Barb clapped, and she once filed a noise complaint over wind chimes. Sheila didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her face said everything. She knew. The game had changed. I wasn't the weird guy with the ugly shed anymore. I was the guy with the paperwork. And for the first time in a long time, she looked genuinely afraid of what came next. You could smell the downfall from the parking lot. Maybe it was the mix of nervous sweat and stale muffins wafting out of the HOA clubhouse. Or maybe it was just the unmistakable scent of justice reheated and served lukewarm under fluorescent lights. Either way, it was time. The official emergency community review meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp, called at Sheila's insistence after what she referred to in the email as an escalating campaign of misinformation, unauthorized gatherings, and unverified media narratives. Translation: people finally started pushing back, and her clipboard couldn't save her. I arrived 5 minutes early, not out of respect, purely strategic. I wanted a seat with a clear view of the podium and the exit. I also brought 2 things with me: my lawyer, clean suit, calm expression, voice like a wood chipper in a library, and a stack of report folders containing every document that had built this case from HOA nuisance to administrative scandal. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. People brought folding chairs. One guy had a camcorder like it was 2003, and this was the final episode of Suburban Survivor. Brenda from Lot 6 brought lemonade and a tray of lemon bars, bless her. Sheila took the stage just as the wall clock ticked to 6:01, her blazer sharper than her smile, which had the tightness of someone trying to hold in a scream through her pores. She tapped the mic. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I'd like to begin with some quick clarifications regarding recent confusion over structural compliance policies and community messaging." She gestured to a giant printout labeled HOA CLARITYINITIATIVE, which sounded like something that gets launched from a drone. She rambled for a few minutes, buzzwords like misrepresentation, non-binding documentation, and historic-ish designation. It was a tornado of deflection, and I almost admired the commitment. Almost. Then she made her mistake. She pointed to my barn, well, a blown-up photo of it, and said, "Despite what's been circulated, this structure is neither protected under federal law nor relevant to the historical identity of this neighborhood. It remains an unsanctioned, non-compliant installation." My lawyer stood up like an orchestra conductor who just heard someone play a kazoo in a Mozart piece. "Point of order," he said smoothly, already holding up the notarized easement packet. "This structure, according to both federal and state registry documentation, has been verified as a protected historical building. Your client," he nodded toward me, "holds undisputed legal ownership and preservation rights as recorded in the county archive and recognized by the Virginia Historical Commission." He handed the packet to the board, then, louder this time, for the room. "Which means any effort to alter, destroy, or repurpose the barn was not just unauthorized, it was unlawful." Murmurs, then silence. Then someone gasped. I think it was Barbara, might have been a gasp laugh hybrid. Either way, Sheila's face went full white knuckle, but my lawyer wasn't done. "In addition, we have documented evidence that President Graff instructed third-party contractors to begin demolition without due process. We also have testimony from multiple residents describing harassment, intimidation, and financial penalties levied outside of procedural bounds." He clicked a button. Behind him, a small screen lit up. Exhibit A, a security cam video showing Sheila telling two contractors to start with the south wall. He'll be too busy whining to notice. Exhibit B, a scanned fine mailed to a resident for excessively creative mailbox art. The mailbox in question, a tasteful bronze dolphin. Exhibit C, the financial ledger from a now-resigned board member showing Sheila had used HOA funds to purchase compliance incentives, including a $1,200 espresso machine, for her house. The room cracked. Laughter, groans, full-on audible, "You've got to be kidding me" reactions. And then came the final blow. From the back of the room, a woman in a gray pantsuit stepped forward. Federal badge, calm authority. I hadn't met her before, but I knew her type. Preservation enforcement. She cleared her throat. "I'm Agent Matthews from the Virginia Historical Easement Authority. We've received the formal preservation application. I've reviewed the original land grant, the supplemental documents, and the forensic images of the substructure." She paused. "Pending final review, this site will be formally added to the Protected Historical Register under Act 119-B. Any further tampering or attempted removal by non-governmental bodies will be considered a federal violation." Sheila looked like someone had unplugged her nervous system. Her lips moved, but no words came out. For a moment, I thought she might actually faint or combust. Either would have been poetic. Instead, she sat down. Hard. It was over. There was no applause, not yet. Just a heavy, satisfying silence as the weight of her own arrogance came crashing down around her clipboard-shaped ego. She tried to stand up once more, probably to say something. Spin it, stall, gaslight her way out. But her voice cracked halfway through the sentence and the room wasn't listening anymore. People were turning away. Neighbors were whispering. One guy was already snapping photos of the evidence folder. Brenda handed Agent Matthews a lemon bar. Even Carl, who once threatened to sue over a misdelivered newsletter, gave me a solemn nod like I'd just saved Normandy. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to smile. Sheila had just been exposed. By law, by fact, by her own mouth, and for someone like her, that's worse than jail. That's irrelevance. I left quietly as the board motioned to suspend current leadership until further review. Translation, Sheila was done. The barn still stood behind my house, exactly where it had always been. Untouched, strong, weathered, but undefeated. And for the first time since the war began, I didn't feel like I was defending a building. I'd defended a legacy, and it held. The barn's quiet now. It always was, honestly, but there's a different kind of quiet that comes after a storm finally blows itself out. Like the air gets lighter, and even the creaky floorboards breathe easier. I sit on the back porch most mornings now, cup of coffee in hand, watching the sunlight climb up the side of the cedar planks. I had the busted window pane replaced last week, not with new glass, but with a salvaged piece from the original frame my grandfather stored in the rafters. Apparently even his junk piles were prophetic. The shadow box is whole again too. Took me 3 weeks, a museum-grade restoration kit, and a lot of profanity whispered through gritted teeth, but it's back. Metal polished, letter pressed. His dog tags rethreaded on their original chain. It's mounted now on the barn's interior wall, center beam, just below the old sketch he carved of our family initials. I catch myself standing in front of it sometimes, coffee gone cold, reading his note like it still has something new to teach me. Turns out it does. The neighborhood's changed too, not overnight, not in some movie montage way with swelling violins and potluck redemption arcs, but it's better. Brenda hosts a monthly block brunch now. BYO casserole, no HOA required. Carl started a lawn tools share program, which is surprisingly functional considering he used to have passive-aggressive turf wars over leaf blowers. And Barb finally smiled again. The HOA still exists. Technically. Sheila resigned under the elegant banner of personal reevaluation, which I assume is legalese for oops. The board dissolved 2 weeks later. A vote was held to reconstitute it, but nobody volunteered. Well, that's not entirely true. One guy raised his hand, then immediately put it back down when someone asked if he liked meetings. The HOA mailbox now holds gardening flyers and lost cat posters, which, frankly, feels like an upgrade. As for Sheila, the last I heard, she moved out of state. Arizona, maybe, somewhere HOA heavy. I wish the local board there the best of luck and nerves of steel. Word on the street is she tried to start a new compliance coalition in her new neighborhood, but it folded when someone pointed out she'd used community funds to order monogram tape measures. Old habits die hard. The funniest part? Her infamous eyesore grade 3 citation, the one she posted all over the neighborhood, is now laminated and nailed above the barn door like a trophy. Someone left it anonymously in my mailbox, complete with a gold sticker that just says, "Historical enough for you?" It makes me laugh every time I walk past it. Not out of spite, out of relief, out of the kind of peace that comes from knowing you held your ground, literally and metaphorically, and didn't let someone bully legacy out of existence just because they thought it clashed with beige siding. I didn't win with force. I didn't scream or sabotage or stoop. I used what I had, facts, patience, documents older than half the streets in this subdivision, and let the truth carry the weight. Now the barn stands a little prouder, or maybe I just see it differently. It's not just a building anymore. It's proof that history matters, even in suburbs where people measure lawn heights and passive-aggressively weaponize wind chimes. Some nights, when it's quiet enough, I leave the barn doors open and let the breeze move through. I swear it carries memories with it. Sawdust, sweat, old jazz on a dusty radio, my grandfather's footsteps. And every now and then, I lean back in my chair, sip my coffee, and glance at the laminated grade 3 plaque. Ugly, I mutter with a smile, and undefeated. Just the way he would have liked it.